So we've got our images imported, we've got our comic data files set up, we've got sequences and panels and layers animating. Now let's add some audio. So there are 3 different ways I can add audio to my comic. I can add background audio to a sequence that will play throughout this entire sequence. Most of the time that's going to be background music. I can also add background audio to a panel that will only play while this specific panel is on screen. I usually use that for an ambient sound effect that sort of enhances the setting of a panel, like jungle noises or spaceship rumble. And I can also add a triggered sound to a panel. This would be more like a momentary sound effect that might sync up to an animation, like a door opening or a gun blast. The good news is adding audio is very simple in most cases, so let's take a look. To add background audio to a sequence, I just need to add an audio property to the sequence. This will be a table, so I use curly braces, and inside I just list the audio file I want to use. Now, just like with images, the path to this audio is relative, but in this case, it's relative to the audio folder in my project instead of the images folder. So you can see in my audio folder here, I have separate subfolders for each sequence, just like I do for my images. That's a personal preference. And this is the file that I'll use for my background. Often my sequence background audio is music, but in this case, I'm going to use this ambient night sound. Sounds like this. So these audio files should be WAV files encoded in the AD-PCM format, like Panic recommends in the developer docs. So by default, this file will play through once and then stop, but I can make it loop by just adding a loop property to the audio table. And that's all I need to do to add background audio to my sequence. Background audio for a panel works exactly the same way, except I add this audio table to the panel instead of the sequence. So I'll just come down here to this panel. So again, I just add the audio property and specify the file that I want to use. And if I want it to loop, set loop to true. For this panel, I'm going to use this mechanical humming sound. Now, if I run this sequence, I should hear my ambient background sounds playing through this entire sequence. And when I get to this specific panel, I'll hear that humming sound kick in. And then it fades away as I scroll out of that panel. What could be easier? And singular sound effects are only slightly more complicated because we need to specify what triggers them to play since they're not playing continuously. So just like with time-based animations, I can set a button or a scroll position to trigger a sound effect. So in this panel, I have 2 layers that each have frame-based animations with 2 images each. Since there are 2 images here, that means that these layers will transition between images at the halfway scroll point when the panel is fully centered on the screen. So if I want to sync a sound effect with that image change, I can set the scroll trigger for my audio file to the halfway point. Remember, scroll values go from 0 when the panel first appears on the screen to 1 when the panel is just about to leave the screen. So 0.5 is right when the panel is center screen. Now if I test this once more, I can hear my sequence background playing. When I scroll to this other panel, I can hear my panel background. And then just at the moment this frame animation triggers, I hear that sound effect. So that's a good way to sync audio to a frame-based animation. But what about a time-based animation? That's actually even easier because all I need to do is add the audio table to the animate property on my layer, and it will use the same trigger as the layer animation. So let's look at an example in another sequence. So right here, I've got a layer animation, and it's animating the position, the X and the Y of this layer when the user presses the A button. It's got a duration, and it even uses some easing to make the animation look a little bit nicer. And then just by adding the audio property to the animation, I'll get this audio file playing at the exact same time that this animation is triggered. And I can even add a delay to the audio table, because I might want this audio to trigger when the animation completes instead of when it starts. So I can see this animation takes 700 milliseconds to complete, so I can add a delay of 700 milliseconds to the sound effect. Then when this animation gets triggered by the A button, the animation starts, and 700 milliseconds later, just as the animation is finishing, this sound effect will play. By adding audio to the animations like this, I can even have multiple sound effects in a single panel, all being triggered by different layers. And that's really all there is to adding audio to your panels comics.